Welcome to Writing the Wrong Way, where we talk about how writing works, how writers work, and why the best writers risk being strange. And we have here today Lyndon Radchenka, who, if you've been listening to this podcast, you probably know. He does a lot of stuff with me, works in all my comics as the letterer, but also works with me at Stranger Fiction doing stuff. I don't remember what your title is, Lyndon. I don't remember what my title is. What is your title at Stranger Fiction?
Something made up. I think it's something
made up.
related to content development. I really should make it cooler.
Yeah, I do hate the term content. But at some point, some super cool thing that he does, and then, of course, is a writer as well in his own right, and that's what we want to talk about today. Is Lyndon's big news that he's been sharing recently on social media and whatnot, is that he has his first gig writing a DC comic. And so he's got, if you're watching the video, you can see his little DC logo on his sweater there. Now, designating him as a DC author, as opposed to simply the DC fanboy of yesteryear. Now, Lyndon, can you just dive a little bit into what does that even mean that you're writing a DC comic?
And it means that I have a check that was sent to me from DC Comics, and they are paying me money in exchange for me writing words on a piece of paper for them related to one of their characters that I get absolutely no claim to the rights of.
Right. So those of you who don't know the comics world, or who maybe just don't understand some of the particulars of writing, in this scenario, Lyndon's, has been hired effectively, right, as he says, paid money to do writing for DC Comics, the company / brand / organization, and of course for the characters they own. So this is, DC superhero world realm, the particular character. We can't really get into the details of what the story is that Lyndon is writing, but it is public knowledge what character he's writing, which is Zatannic, a story in the Satanic Panic comic that you should and can go out and pre-order at your local comic store. If it's not too late, go to Zatannic, go to your comic store, pre-order Satanic Panic.
Anytime before September 1st.
Yeah, and so that's an anthology, of course, with various stories in it, one of which is by Lyndon, and the artist that you've been paired with Lyndon was John McCrae. Is that correct?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, a great artist, by the way. And then who else is in that book as writers and artists and teams and so on? You can go find on a press release. But we're kind of concerned primarily. So the comic then is a anthology, again, multiple creator teams. Now, explain a little bit about what it means to be part of a writer in a comic like that for a company like DC, because you're going into it not as a team, right? But can you talk a little bit about what it means for people who don't necessarily know how the comics world works in this realm exactly, or even if they do think they know, maybe, just a bit of the specifics, if as far as you're allowed to talk about specifics of how you kind of became a writer for this DC comic and sort of how you kind of ended up working with McCrae.
Yeah, so it's a really long story in the sense that it goes back a long ways. This all sort of started through my creator-owned series, The Laundryman. And that's a book that I've been working on with artist Stephen Call for a number of years. And about 2.5 years ago, right as we were wrapping the production on our volume 1 of The Laundryman, I was showing it to Scott Snyder, who is a comics writer in his own regard. At the time, he was not working for DC Comics. He was doing a stint of indie books. And part of that and part of the fallout of the pandemic was he had started a class on writing. And for some students who paid to be part of a more exclusive tier of that class, we were given very short, very brief access to one-on-one meetings with Scott. And so he had been giving us, or he had been giving me feedback on the Laundrymen and was preparing to use the book as material, student-made material that he was going to use in one of his classes, which he did end up doing again about two years ago. And as we were chatting about that, and he was giving his feedback, I asked him how a new writer would be able to find work at DC Comics, and he didn't actually know the answer to that question at the time. But what he did do was go through the efforts of reaching out to editors at DC Comics to find the answer. And what that answer became was at DC Comics, because they have such a stable of experienced creatives that they use and have a history of using, when they decide to bring in someone new, they like to put them on an anthology project, which is a collection of short comics, usually about 10 pages long. That's how long mine is. And they give them a small project that they can test those creatives with. And for the person who is not familiar with comics, the value of doing that is in a short project like an anthology, you're telling one enclosed story. The work does not stretch an overly long amount of time, and then the editors that are in charge of these books get a sense of whether or not you're someone that they can work with and what it's like to work with you. So Scott reached out to a number of editors to find out who was in charge of those anthologies, and he helped introduce me to the editor that was in charge of them. And at that point, I made contact with them and didn't hear anything from them again for a very long time. And it wasn't until I, almost a year later, when I was traveling to New York Comic Con, that I finally met this editor in person, just in passing at the New York Comic Con. They told me at that time they'd read my work, they had liked it, and if something became available, they would let me know. And another year and a half went by before that materialized into anything. And in that 2.5 years, I spent a lot of time reaching out to that editor, checking in regularly, sending work to them, new work, and always staying polite, not pushy, but expressing an interest in working together. And then suddenly, in February of this past year, 2025, I received an email saying there's an anthology coming up for our Halloween book. There's space in it. If you're interested in participating, please send us your pitches. If something works out, we'd like to pair you with the artist John McCrae, who has been an industry veteran for longer than I've been reading comics, who's forgotten more about comics than I've ever learned, and has been an absolute delight to work with on this. So that's how I ended up working with DC and with John. Is I sent in a number of pitches. They all got rejected. Then DC told me that they needed someone to write for Zatanna in the book, and they gave me, my editor on the project gave me some titles that Zatanna had featured in recently. I went back and I read all of those issues, and then I started to think about what sort of story I'd like to tell. I provided him with 3 additional pitches, which are just single-page summaries describing what those stories look like. And he chose one, and we were sort of off to the races after that.
So there's a couple things skipped over there that I think are worth just sort of coming back to and dragging out slightly. So one thing is, so Scott Snyder very helpfully got you this introduction to the DC editor, but it's worth pointing out that that isn't necessarily getting you on the book at all.
Right.
And as you say, so one thing that is easy to miss in there, if you weren't listening closely, is it's still 2 years after that point that, you know, Lennon gets a actual job. It's also worth, I'll just point out also that at the same time frame, Snyder introduced me to the same editor. And as you can see, I don't have, you know, a job working at a DC in this anthology right here, which, is for a variety of reasons. But one certainly thing to just note there is that the introduction doesn't necessarily mean what people think it means. It's not that it doesn't mean anything, but it's not like the foot in the door that everyone thinks it is. It is, even with that, a lot of work, and a lot of, is anything available? A lot of, um, just keeping on the editor, but in a nice, friendly manner. Keep doing things like Lyndon, of course, in that interim period, isn't just sitting around waiting for, people to call him. He's not even just sitting around pitching other people. Oh, he's probably also doing that, but it's a combination of things that you kind of have to be doing always, like, which is, one, quote unquote, networking, which isn't as helpful as people think it is, but it is, an important thing to do. And then doing your own work, creator-owned work. In this case, you mentioned The Laundryman as an example, but that's not the only book that you have worked on or even that put out in the interim. Hero Man, for example, came out in this intervening period with at Bay Press, which people can go order. And you've had other books as well coming out. You've had books picked up and dropped,
Yeah.
though, because the publisher went under in the intervening period,
Yeah, there
as
was
did
no.
I with a different person. Yeah.
Yeah.
And at the same time, have been pitching out other people uh, who aren't DC, trying to get other things spun up, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of invisible work, but the visible work, I think, also is like the work of, like, getting an introduction to an editor, communicating with the editor, and, meeting them at the Comic Cons and all that stuff. I think something that's easy for people who don't have as much experience in these realms to overlook is, I find that people often they'll put too much weight on certain things like the networking effects, and they won't put as enough weight on the totally disconnected things like putting out Hero Man that I think honestly probably matter more on a certain level. Because, as you say, like, one of the things that kind of happens in this whole intervening period, and one of the ways you kind of keep on an editor's radar as a possible viable writer to hire, is by just sort of being out there doing things and being visibly doing things
Hmm.
that where uh, I'm not sure the best way to put it, but like, the thing you kind of have to do in this industry is make it clear to other people that you don't necessarily need them, if that makes sense.
Totally.
And not that you don't need them, but you don't necessarily need them. And there's a level, I think, where it can open a lot of doors if you are just sort of pleasantly doing your own thing and just visibly doing your own thing. And, like, bringing it up to their attention, because they're not necessarily out reading every single thing all the time.
Well, and the other thing that's really important in this story was um, that I was only able to ask Scott to make that introduction because I was producing work of a certain quality already.
And had
And
already been putting work out.
right, exactly. So when I sent him my portfolio of work, he saw that I had already been working on 4 or 5 books. We had run the Kickstarter for Laundryman already. It had been successful. I had sort of a albeit small, public footprint that showed I was already working on things and getting things done. And then when he actually looked at the quality of work, he found it to be at a level that he felt comfortable enough passing my name along to an editor at one of these companies. And that's something that I think can get lost when people are imagining trying to live out their dream of working for DC Comics. Is you don't show up there ready to write those stories. I mean, I'm writing one and I don't feel ready to write one. You just try and do the best that you can do. But you don't no one is born, commercially ready or talented ready in this field. You have to spend the time honing your craft to a certain point before you can be expected to, before you can start asking yourself to reach some of those higher levels, I think.
I was talking a while back to Brian Bendis, who of
Hmm.
course is best maybe known for Miles Morales, but is again a comic writing legend. And one of the interesting things that he said was that when he was starting out, he had a book on the stands, and the one of the editors at I forget if it was DC or Marvel, I think it was Marvel, but one of the editors at Marvel was literally buying his book off the stands every week, every month, but still wasn't giving him work. Like he loved the guy's writing, he wanted to hire him, but there wasn't there was no way
It
to do it.
wasn't work. Yeah.
There wasn't work.
Yeah.
And you can weirdly end up in those sorts of scenarios sometimes where, you know, you are beloved uh, by an editor or in the industry, but there's not necessarily a thing for you to do because one of the weirdnesses in here that you'll never understand, for example, is why do they want a Zatanna story? And you don't know the answer to that necessarily, nor do you know, nor do they maybe on a
I
certain
mean,
level.
I would assume they have some sort of market research or a long-term plan with the character and are always trying to keep their stable of characters fresh and showcase them as much as they can. But I didn't ask the
It's a
question
fair
why
assumption,
Zatanna
but
when
who
they
knows?
right when they asked me to write it. I didn't ask why. I said yes, please. That sounds great.
Right. But like there's the point simply being that there are some machineries at work that you don't necessarily ever understand. And that, are going on behind the scenes. And they may be not be, significant or about to be significant or not. Like who knows, right?
Hmm.
Um, and as you say, like there's often this combination of trying to do your own thing, keep your head down, keep moving forward, but then also like be making connections and showing sort of, your work as it were, while at the same time just sort of taking advantage of opportunities that come your way.
Hmm.
Like, all of a sudden, there's this opportunity to be in this anthology, say. Um, uh, Now, I don't know to what degree you can talk about the process of the back and forth of it. Like you can't talk about what's in it, I know, but is there anything you can say about the process of working with McCrae or in that kind of back and forth editorial that maybe surprised you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think talking about the technical aspects of writing are are out of bounds. So I'll describe sort of my process, and I'm not going to say that this is a universal experience for every writer. I'm sure that someone like Tom King or Scott himself don't go through the same sort of editorial um, process that I did as someone new coming into the DC shed. But what it looked like for me was I was invited to pitch for this anthology, and at that time they said I could pitch any character that I wanted to, which is an extremely daunting task. And I reflected on some of the characters that had meant the most to me growing up and in the books that I'd been reading recently, and chose some bigger name, larger profile characters. I essentially said, if I'm never going to be able to pitch again, I want to say that I've pitched sort of as big as I can go. And I sent in some ideas. They weren't the fit, they weren't the type of story that the editors were looking for in this book. I sent in another round of pitches with some with different characters, some with the same characters. Those were not the same. Those also were not quite the right fit, though it seemed like they were closer. And then they reached out to me and said, what we need for this book actually is someone to write Zatanna, because the book is called Zatannic Panic, and there's no one currently lined up to write her. And so I had a meeting with them. They gave me some editorial direction on sort of the style of story they would like to see. And again, titles, recent titles that Zatannic had featured in, and I went off and read those and sent in another 3 submissions. And what was funny was it's the third one that I sort of sent in or wrote as an afterthought. That was the one. Don't get me wrong, not an afterthought. It was meaningful to me, but it was the last one that I thought of, and it came to me all at once right before I was ready to submit these pitches, because I had originally just planned to send in 2 ideas. They'd asked for 1 or 2, and I ended up including this third idea that ended up being the one that they said they wanted to go with. And from that stage, I got a little bit of editorial feedback on elements that they wanted me to introduce in the story, but I was given the green light to go ahead into breakdowns, which are a stripped. I treated it as a stripped down version of a script. So I gave my panel counts, a rough panel counts, and the beat that I imagined would happen in each of these panels. I did some rough dialogue that I attached to it also, and I sent those back. And my editor gave me some additional elements that he wanted to see introduced into the story, but told me that I was greenlit to go to a full script format. At this point, I asked if John McCrae was still the artist that was going to be included on the story, and they checked in with him. He confirmed he was locked in, and then I started to do my full script of the project. And that, for someone who's never written a comic or isn't familiar with the back end of comic writing, a full script is a fully descriptive breakdown of what is going to go on each page, and that includes all of the dialogue as you see it, as accurate panel descriptions as you can give, and the entire story. And knowing that I was going to be working with a industry veteran in John, I made a note. I wrote a note to him at the beginning of my script, essentially saying, like, you can throw all of this away if you want to, because I trust that as the artist, you're going to be able to make this look far more imaginative and cool and dark and scary and all these other adjectives than anything I could ever imagine. So this is just how I'm picturing it. Here are some of my cultural touchstone inspirations that I was using when imagining this, but by all means, have fun with it, do whatever you like with it. And I sent all of these, I sent my full script off to my editor after writing this, and he sent it off to John, who then started to produce the artwork based on it. And John would send us in a new page of art every couple of days, usually actually very close to the script that I'd provided, but every once in a while he would make a change, and it was consistently for the better. And as he was sending in these art pages, I would then take my script that I had written for him, and I would update it and make changes to it to better suit the art. This is the collaborative nature of making comics. Is I sing the first verse, you sing the second verse, and then we meet in the chorus, and the chorus is the comic. So because I have a background in lettering, I actually took his black and white inked drawings and I lettered over top of them myself so that I could see the way the word balloons would flow and how the dialogue looked, and how and the sorts of changes that I thought made the most sense. And when all the art was in, and I'd had a chance to see it all together, I finished my revised script and I sent that off to my editor. And at the time of this recording, that's all I've heard. At some point, it will get sent to a colorist and the actual letterer, which is not me. And potentially, I may even get some revisions from my editor, and I'll make those changes when that time comes. And then it'll get sent to the printer, and it'll be in comic stores for October 1st.
But can be pre-ordered in comic stores now. Now,
Yeah.
for those of you who don't write comics or aren't familiar with that script process that Lyndon just laid out, when he mentions that you can kind of give the artist like say things to the artist like, if you have a better idea, do your idea. Usually what that specifically refers to is panel breakdowns, page layout, which would be noted in the script, typically in a full script. Some people do more or less. I do it very minimally. But, it's more standard to give a fuller explanation of where the panels would go. And sometimes it refers to, visuals, particular visuals. Like if you think, the panel should look like X, Y, Z. Sometimes an artist will come in and alter that substantially, while sort of keeping it in the story flow. And again, some artists will stick to the script a bit more. Some artists will veer from it more. Some will do a combination of both. When we were doing Last Breeds, Scott Henderson would once in a while have a really great idea for just totally dispensing with the breakdowns that I might have suggested and doing like a really interesting visual, experiment with the panels or what have you, for example. Whereas other times, they might, he might be following that script pretty closely. And that's a pretty standard thing, but, it depends on, as you say, like kind of how the artist is seeing things and how they want to work. And just, whether they honestly like your script or not, to be frank.
Well, and some artists or some writers even work with more of a Marvel style, known as the Marvel style script writing method, which is they give more of a brief summary of what's going to occur in the issue to the artist, and they give the artist a lot of freedom to sort of run off with that and produce all of the artwork. And then they'll come in at the end and they'll write to the existing artwork. That wasn't that both
It's not
wasn't
standard with DC.
I don't know if it is or not, but it wasn't an option that was offered to me, and it isn't one that I would have taken, even if it was.
How descriptive do your scripts tend to be, generally speaking? Did
I
you
always
overwrite the script in a sense that, because this is an artist you haven't worked with before, unlike Stephen, who you do have worked with. And when you work with Stephen Call, I know you often will collaborate on the story itself prior to you taking it and drumming out a script. So I'm presuming that you had a more detailed script than you might have given Stephen, but is that the case?
it was actually very similar, and that's because early on in my comics writing, I guess journey career, I adopted the commonly known rule of thumb when it comes to script writing, which is that when scripting, a single 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper should not contain more than one page of comic art, essentially saying, if I'm going to write the script for page 1, panel 1, that comic sheet or that my script sheet should only be 1 page long. And to go over that amount means that you're overwriting it. And so I always try and stick to this idea that, to write a script for a 22-page floppy comic, my script should be about 22 pages. And it's like that with The Laundryman. It was like that with this comic. On occasion in The Laundryman now, I've gotten to a place of comfort where, we'll get to an action sequence and I'll say to Steven, like, pages 6, 7, and 8 are a chase scene. You can decide how you want it to play out, but it's all action, and I just need it to sort of end on this particular beat. And then that 22-page script will become 18 pages because I don't have to write those 3 pages. And then I write it at the end. But because this is a lot more compact, I didn't do it that way. I was talking to another artist who's worked on books like these before, and something that he said was that it's, especially for short comics, it's really easy to overwrite them and really jam them full of dialogue and text because there is such a short amount of space that you're dealing with. And the editors at DC, when they first invited me to pitch, reminded me on a couple of occasions before I'd actually sent them anything. This is only 10 pages. It's not very long. Please just keep that in mind as you're as you're crafting your ideas. And so I when I learned that I was working with a veteran like John, I really just kind of wanted to stay out of his way because I knew that his art was going to shine so bright, and I was just going to go along for the ride, and it definitely turned out that way.
When you're coming up with a story idea, like a short comic story idea, as opposed to say an issue length or a longer multi-issue story, um, what are the considerations to for figuring out like what kind of stories I can tell, and how to keep it concise and short, but yet interesting and engaging? Like, what are the sort of the barometers you use to figure out like this is an idea that will work versus this is an idea that won't work?
I think I don't have a technical answer to this because I don't I haven't written that many short comics. You know, we did a couple for our Project Dead work, or I wrote one for Dire Beasts, but I don't have a long history of writing anthology-sized comics. So when I came to it, I started with the simple idea that I needed to get into the core of the action or the movement of the story as soon as possible and as late as possible so that I would have as much time as I could find to drag out the conflict and sort of the emotional core of the story. Um, as a storyteller, all of my I would say that my priorities are very character driven and not necessarily super high concept. And so when I came to this story, it really came down to a feel of planning out the page size. And I think that's probably it's the same way that I would tackle a 22 page floppy was when I'm imagining the beats, can all of what I'm picturing in my head fit onto a single page? And then if it can, what is the next page, or what is the 2 page spread look like? Can I break this down into 5 2 page scenes essentially? And if I only have 5 scenes, can I tell a full story? And when you read my comic, I can't get into too many of the plot details. But when you read my comic, pages 1 and 10 are sort of the outer shell of the full story, and then from pages 2 to 9, you're essentially looking at a series of 2 page scenes. Sometimes a single page, a single page followed by a 2 page scene, followed by a single page scene. But nonetheless, it's a series of almost short vignettes that all tie together to tell the overall story. So that's how I approached mine. But I'm not going to pretend that that is uh, the the only way to do it or the common way to do it.
But when you talk about spreads, you don't necessarily know if they are spreads, right?
How do you mean?
You don't know if you're starting on an odd or an even page, do you?
I think I don't, I didn't ask the explicit question, but I think the industry standard is you always start on the right-hand side. And I
Yeah,
plotted
I
mine.
presume so. But
Yeah,
but you weren't 100% given that instruction.
no, I wasn't. But from looking at past anthologies, that's typically how it's done.
And then, so when you're thinking through things like page turns, or when you're thinking through, how to make this story pace, are there things that kind of flag for you when you're in the writing process, um, when you feel like it's going well or when it's not going well? Like, are there things that kind of you stop and think, okay, I gotta try this differently, or this is working? Like, how do you assess as you're writing what you think, whether you think the thing is working?
I think the first major thing that I flag is, are my um, pages ending in the right spot? And that's applicable both to the page turn and to the non-page turn. Typically, I've read or, been told, if you can ask, the end of every comic page should have some reason to read the next page. Now, it's doubly true if you're dealing with a page turn, but it remains true even when you're not. And so when I'm plotting out my pages, if there isn't some sort of driving force behind that last panel on the page, then I know that I'm pacing it wrong. And I have to go back and find, usually I have to go and either add a moment or subtract a moment to keep that pace moving. And whether that means I'm, cutting a panel, I'm blending a couple moments more tightly without getting into the weeds. I always look at where the page ends as whether or not I'm pacing things properly.
Do you think about one of the things I do early on is I'll think about, as you were saying, kind of what's on a page, like what's the not just story that's on the page, what plot is on this page, but and how that works as a unit, but what's like the emotional moment on this page. And I try to really strip it down to like a core moment in the plot, a core moment in the emotional character arc or the story arc of the thing. Um, and one, condense it to that, but two, try not to add more things. Do you do anything along those lines in the early stages when you're fleshing out the idea?
Not necessarily when I'm fleshing out the idea. I think at that point I'm more concerned about what questions each page is either asking or answering. And that is another ingredient that I try and use to keep stories moving forward, is that anytime you resolve a question that's been asked, you at the same time need to be asking another one. And finding the emotional crest of that question is also always a great point to flip the page. So I guess I think when it comes down to um, your point, which is the emotionality of each moment, it is a consideration, but it seems like look at it or frame it slightly differently. Um, and I usually, yeah, I consider really what is being revealed to the reader. I'm always asking myself, if I'm the reader of this, what have I just learned? And what am I trying to figure out next?
Sure, that makes sense. Now, Lennon, what do you say to somebody who um, wants to know more about this pitch process? Like when you say pitch this idea, that idea, and so on, what do you mean by that? Like, what is a pitch in this context?
I mean, it's a hilarious question because when I was invited to pitch, I asked, "What format do you like your pitches?" And I was given sort of a nebulous description, which was, a paragraph or two describe the characters and the conflict and the start of story you're telling. Um, but it's not the detail. It wasn't like a detailed breakdown of what a pitch looks like, which I think is in a microcosm the entire comics industry, because there's no standard way of doing anything in this business.
Including
Yes.
scripts that we're talking about. When we talk about
Exactly.
these
Yeah.
scripts, it's not like screenwriting, by the way, people, where you have a set format. People do a similar thing to one another often, but my script will look very different from Lyndon's script for no reason
Yeah.
necessarily.
Yeah. Personal preference. And so when I did my script or my pitches, I stuck to the same format for all of them, which was, a made up name of the story, the characters that I was including, a sort of one line, I'd almost call it an elevator pitch where I try and pull in some of the inspirations for the story, and then a half page to one page, usually it was about three-quarters of a page, plot description of what I imagined was going to be in each story. And so, I say similar to the script rule, I tried to have every pitch that I wrote fit on a single piece of paper, especially for a 10-page, because it's not an overly long script, and I'm not sure how you could overwrite a 10-page comic more than a single page pitch without getting into full breakdowns or dialogue. Um, so I tried to stick to that format, but it's not a uniform thing across the industry at all.
And what do you say to the person who, might want to pitch DC in this manner, but is worried they're going to steal their ideas?
No one, no one stealing ideas. Um,
People are always talking about this.
yeah, yeah, no one's gonna steal your idea. I mean, first off, it's DC's characters, so they can do whatever they want with them.
I always
Um,
say if you have an idea for Batman and you want to pitch DC on Batman, you've stole their idea. You
yeah,
have
you
to
stole DC's
acknowledge that you
character.
stole their idea. Like that's
Yeah,
the sort of baseline of where you're starting from. So the idea that, you're worried they might take your Batman story is ridiculous.
right. So, I mean, I guess if I have advice, it's going to be similar to a lot of the other advice you hear from industry professionals is you can't pitch them any ideas for their characters unless they ask you to. They can't read your pitches unless they have asked you, unless they've sort of solicited them. And whatever idea you give them is something that they are going to own. However, because you are your own creative, nothing that you make would look identical to what anyone else can make. So even if someone took your one-page pitch, their comic is going to look entirely different from what yours will look like. So there is, you know, there is idea theft and then there's not idea theft because you can't ever recreate two of the same things. But if you are someone who wants to pitch DC Comics and you don't know how to do so, my advice would be find a way to get invited to do so and don't send them anything without being asked for it.
Yeah, and that's less, as a lawyer, you also, of course, know, unlike many people asking this question,
Yeah,
that it's not possible to steal ideas because
right.
ideas cannot be owned. But in any case, that is a sort of the standard thing people always worry about for no reason, by the way. Um, well, now, Lyndon, what are you doing to celebrate now that you've broken through and you've broken into comics?
I'm trying to find a
You just
way
put your
to,
feet up
yeah,
and
I'm
you
trying to
film my
find a
note.
way to convince them to hire me again, is how I'm celebrating. Because once you have the first job, congratulations, that's the first job. Now
Talk a
you get
little
to
bit
find your
about
second
this
job.
idea of breaking in, because from the point of view of many people, you have now broken in, quote unquote, to the industry. You've broken in to DC Comics. It's smooth sailing from here,
Yeah.
and so on. So, talk a little bit about that idea and where that idea comes from, maybe, or just sort of how you see that idea in people talking about it
Yeah.
versus how you maybe feel about it right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because um, from a DC perspective, it's nothing, right? It's a 10-page short comic and I could be in and it could come out and never be reprinted and never seen again and that's it. But from a an indie comics question, it's exciting. It's a big deal. There's a lot of people that I'm sure would love the same opportunity, and I'm so grateful for it all the time, and I'm excited to see it actually come out. And I'm trying to force myself to enjoy it, the fact that I got the opportunity and it's going to come out, but the other part of me is just like, okay, what's next? Like, what's the next thing to that we need to do?
It's a very good thing to note, I think, what you just said, that it's a weird borderline space where it is both a big deal and not a big deal, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Depending on how you're looking at it and what direction you're looking at it. So on one
yeah,
hand, you have sort of crossed a line that is very hard to cross. Um, a number of lines. One is just getting a script written, never mind anybody making it. Two is getting a script bought. Uh, Three is getting a script produced, because sometimes, these things can
yeah,
get bought and never produced. It doesn't
yeah,
happen a ton in comics, but it happens all the time in film. Um, there's also DC Comics as, the publisher slash company that has actually hired you to do a thing, as opposed to, as the constant barrage of people trying to get that to
Mhm.
happen, and so on and so on. So there's a lot of like ways in which you've now like quote unquote broken through, as it were. But also, as you say, it's from the other side of it, you're not Scott Snyder, right? Like there's a
Yeah.
very different, it's like a bunch of other, it's like you've traveled a great distance, but there's also like this great distance in front of you, as it were, or
Yeah.
should you choose to try to traverse it.
Yeah.
So it's a weird, I think, interesting space for somebody to be in, because it is a difficult thing to accomplish. But I've also, of course, you're probably, anxious about the question of like, well, am I ever going to, I forget who we were listening to. You shared a podcast to me where
Yeah.
someone was talking about how they got their a Wolverine story in. Do you remember who
Jason
that
Aaron.
was? Jason Aaron was talking about
Jason
how
Aaron.
when he first got hired to do a Wolverine story, like just kind of, and then he didn't work for five
He
more years.
he won a contest.
Yeah.
He won a contest to
And it
get
is a great
published
story.
by,
I remember
yeah,
that
it was a
story.
short story contest to get published by Marvel Comics.
Yeah.
And he won it, and he's Jason Aaron. And
And he's Jason
he
Aaron.
the
Keep in
comic was
mind,
made. Yeah.
and
And
he's
then he didn't work for
demonstrably
years
a great
after.
writer
Yes.
who we've seen
And then
great
he
work
didn't,
from.
yeah, and then he didn't work for a number of years. And he was at the Calgary Expo, and I went and talked to him about that story and told him, I have a story coming out. Thank you for, putting the fear of the universe in me that this is going to come out and then I'm not going to work again. Um, but it's
And it's not
something that I
what
want,
happened.
right. But something that also that I wanted to touch in on this conversation, and you're a great person to talk about it, Jonathan, was not only do you need to do good work, but to get published by someone like DC Comics or Marvel, the work you need to produce needs to meet a certain standard of commercialism or commercialability. It needs to be commercial
Normally,
work. Yeah. And
I would say not always. Grant Morrison is a good example of a person who does
sure.
not do commercial work,
Right.
but had one of the most commercial successes of DC Comics history.
Right.
Who knows why?
Right.
Sometimes there's strange things, but that's a very good point to make as well.
But when we talk to our colleague Gregory Kmichek, he talks about having his own portfolio review with DC editors and them telling him, you need to show us that you can do the work in the style because we don't have the imagination for it. And that's sort of the attitude that I'm approaching this question with, which is that there are so many creatives that do great work. I went to Angoulême to promote Hero Man, and we go to shows that are like Prairie Comics Fest, or you just came back from TCAF, and some of that work is great, but it's part of this indie space drawn in quarterly vibe that is not commercial in the way that mainstream comics are. And so while those creatives are talented in their own right, their work isn't being looked at the same way when considered for work at these mainstream publishers.
I would even specifically cite myself as the example.
That's why I wanted to talk to you about it.
A person who also got an introduction via Scott Snyder, DC Comics. Also is, in communication with the editor, showing them portfolios, so on and so forth. But if you stack your work against my work, the work that's out and available and people can see, I would argue that it's very clear that you are a more commercial writer than I am. Now, if you were to look at the new book coming out, Last Breeds, perhaps people would think differently. But,
Right.
that's as a person who has both commercial ambitions and non-commercial ambitions, let's just put it that way. Um, I'm very cognizant of the fact that I need to be showing, like, they can't just take your word for it. Like, they can't just hear from Scott Snyder, you're a good writer, and look at your actual good writing and also believe that you could do this other thing, because it is a different thing. Like my Eye Collector book, you can love it or hate it. I would say is arguably, or not arguably, but it's inarguably well written. But that doesn't mean I can write a superhero story.
Right.
You have to see me write a superhero story to know if I can do it. I've
Right.
won, made writing awards. That doesn't mean that I can write, a kid's picture book. You'd have to see me do it, right? And
Right.
so like there's a level where you're sort of that's why I always joke about the breaking in thing because you always
Right.
sort of have to break in. We've talked about that in other podcasts. You're always sort of breaking in. You're always sort of trying to prove yourself. And you're always kind of walking a line, I think, as a writer, where on one hand you want to point back at the things you've done and also just personally celebrate the things you've done. But you also kind of have to be uh you can't assume too much. Like you can't assume like, you should neither in this scenario be assuming that no other work will come your way or a bunch of other work will come your way. You can't
Right.
assume anything.
Yeah.
You can't assume you'll be, unemployable for, a decade or,
Right.
you're going to get a big book out of the gate next. You can't
Yeah.
assume anything. It's just,
Yeah.
you have to sort of just work with what you're given. In investing, we sometimes say that, you work with what the index gives you. You
Mhm.
just take what you take your day's gains. And,
Right.
it just becomes about like, how do you take your day's gains and not, and kind of compound on your efforts into the future, not
Right.
lose ground, and so on, And so I think the way that a lot of writers lose ground, and I think the way a lot of writers go wrong is on two things, which are tough because they're almost in opposition. One is that they put too much stock into what they've already done. And the second is they put too little stock in what they've already done. And we've known writers who like have like had movies produced and don't even like mention it
Right.
on their website,
Yeah.
for example. Um, and like that's an incredible accomplishment, especially when you know how hard it is to get the movie produced. And we also know writers who like have done like one little thing and are still, trying to ride that wave of like a
Yeah.
thing they did 10 years ago,
Yeah.
And you can't really do either. You have to sort of find like a happy medium of like, here's what I've been doing recently. So one, you got to be doing things, but two, like you can't just discount everything you've done and like pretend it didn't exist and just move on with life. You have to sort of keep bringing it to people's attention. But
Right.
also you got to be careful, like you've got a new thing coming,
But
or whatever.
the other part of that I think it's important for writers to consider is, if your goal is to write a story for DC Comics, and my goal has always been in part to write a story for DC Comics. When approaching a new project, I always took at least part of me would say, how does this get me closer or further away from the goal of writing for DC Comics? And if there is something else that you're driving towards that working on that project is going to help you achieve, it's okay if it isn't one that helps you with your goal of writing for DC Comics. But if you're focused on trying to reach that mountain, if DC Comics is your mountain, it has to be something that you're at least considering for all of these projects, and that's why on some level that's probably why a lot of my work has been commercial, because on some level I want to be a writer whose work can be published commercially, can be published by DC Comics or Marvel or Image, Boom, Mad Cave, all the other publishers that I read and enjoy. Um, and I'm not necessarily thinking, how does this get me published by Drawn and Quarterly, who is an amazing publisher, but I don't have that style of writing, or I've never practiced that style of writing. So it's not something that I'm putting the same amount of thought into when I'm approaching a new project. And I think it's important for writers to keep those goals in mind with every project, because publishing is such a slow game that it can be hard to stay focused on those end goals if you're not revisiting that, or if you're not revisiting them regularly.
Yeah. And by contrast, one of the reasons that I haven't as fully pursued writing for DC is simply because that's not my big goal. I mean, I like
Hmm.
to do it. I will, I'm sure, do it at some point. But it's certainly not, but I've always been more focused on creator-owned work. I've always been more focused on establishing my own infrastructure, that, that allows me to perhaps, partner with people at other times, but I could do it without them. Like I come out of the punk DIY sort of space, in many respects. And so, I have a real, let's say, commercial side to me, in a sense, but, it's not sort of the core, of what I'm after. Um, Not that that's the only thing you're after, but it's certainly yeah, you've had a much clearer had a path in that sense, whereas my path's a bit more scattered for, good and bad reasons. Um, One thing that you kind of mentioned, like, you're trying to force yourself to enjoy, like having actually
Yeah.
achieved something here. Um,
It's hard.
it's hard also. I think it's probably hard for a couple of reasons. I would suggest one, it's probably hard because you're in a weird space of like you're not holding in your hands yet,
Right.
but maybe it doesn't feel real.
Yeah.
But
Absolutely
also,
true.
right, like, but also I think just knowing you, like personality wise, I think you share a bit of the. I always have this. I once took my daughter Jessie out for sushi to celebrate one of my books being published, and I remember like her asking me like, um, oh, how do you feel, to have your book published? It must be real exciting and you must be real proud and all this stuff. And I said to her, actually, it means nothing to me. I don't feel anything. I go, but what I'm doing here is I'm modeling for you how you should enjoy and celebrate your successes.
Yeah.
Because I
Yeah.
understand intellectually that I should be more excited. I should be like enjoying it more. And that's what I hope for you in your life.
I've
Um,
had a lot of family recently when I've seen them like congratulate me, and I've had to recently catch myself asking for what, because it's, you know, this announcement of the
you're right.
solicit came out a month ago. There's no news now. It's all old hat. So I'm
You,
still trying to enjoy it. But right, I'm still trying to enjoy it, but it's weird. Yeah, it's definitely a
it's
weird
weird,
thing.
but the other thing that's weird about it, I think, like, so one, it can, I think, sometimes be a personality thing, but also honestly, if you're sort of doing things like this, like if you're in the industry and you're doing things in a regular way and you're having,
Mhm.
some level of success where you're not just, striving to get anything all the time, but you actually are like having like things happen, things don't happen, you've got successes, you got failures,
Yeah,
but you're like doing it consistently. When you're doing it consistent like that, there's a sort of normalization that occurs,
yeah,
and it's easy to lose sight of certain things. Like I found when I was younger, it was very easy for me to lose sight of how hard it was to have a book published, and accepted by a publisher. Because everyone I know was putting out books all the time,
yeah,
and it's like it starts to feel like, oh, it's easy, but it's not
yeah,
easy.
yeah,
Like it's just that you kind of start running with the bulls in that sense, where you forget how dangerous it is, and like how many people fall by the wayside
yeah,
because you're just sort of moving forward, and it starts to seem normal to you on a certain level. So it's hard to sort of, there's good and bad sides of that, like you don't get as intimidated by certain things, and other things don't feel like as big a deal. But the bad side of that, of course, is it's harder to enjoy it. I always think about a story. Uh, I remember seeing an old interview with Neil Gaiman, who was asked, "What was the best piece of advice that you ever got, that but didn't take?" Was the question, and he said Stephen King had come up to him. This was when Gaiman was at his height, for Sandman and so on.
and when people still liked him.
People still liked him, and he was a superstar, breaking out. And Sandman was like the biggest selling book and everything. And he said, he was, Stephen King came up to him at some event or something, some book conference or something, and was in reference to like all the excitement and all the success that Gaiman was having, said, "This is really great. You should enjoy it." And Gaiman said it was his biggest regret was not taking that piece of advice because he never
Right,
enjoyed it. He didn't
right,
enjoy a minute of it. um, in that time frame. It was just a job, it was just work, it was just moving from one thing to the next, that he never really sat down and enjoyed the success that he was having, which, as we see in Gaiman's case, is fleeting. Even at that height,
Yeah.
you know, maybe especially at that height. But but it is a tricky thing because you start to kind of like, even if your personality is such that you um, can more easily enjoy things, um, it still sort of starts to feel like less of a big deal because you did it.
Right. I often say that if I can do something, it can't be that hard to do.
Which isn't true, but that's how I understand.
It's
It's
how it
completely
feels.
how you
Yeah.
feel.
Yeah.
Uh, because the other thing you start to realize as you kind of have more, let's say, success in your career, uh, you start to realize how, on one hand, how hard it is to have any level of success, but you also realize, like, after a certain threshold, it's not as hard as it seems because the competition is not as intense as you think it is when you're younger. It is very intense, but there's so few people actually in competition at these higher levels. So it's very hard to get there, but then when you're there, it can be hard to stay there, but it's in some ways easier than you think it is, and also harder than you think it is. I always say to people who get very intimidated at hearing stories about how many books are in the slush pile at
Yeah.
a publisher, like, oh, publisher gets so many books a year.
Yeah.
I always say to them, but yes, but how many of them are actually publishable?
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
if you're
There's so
actually in the
much
realm
junk
of
in the
the
pile.
writing, yeah. And now when you get into like the realm of like, I'm writing for DC, that competition is much more fierce. If you're even in competition,
Right.
it becomes, it's harder than it seems. But also like, but the initial stages are a lot easier than it seems. Like, yeah, as you saw, like, even getting the intro to a DC editor isn't as hard as you think it is. But everything else you thought was easy. I bet you thought at one point that would be the hardest thing.
Well, I think once I got the introduction, hoped that the opportunity would come sooner,
Right.
right?
Which would be
You,
reasonable to think. And I think anyone would think that, you know, I mean, I
yeah,
didn't
and
think that, but that's just because I've been around a little bit
probably
longer than you have, perhaps.
anyone who isn't working in the industry on those books might think that, but I don't know what, the comet's tail looks like from the back end side of the production. I don't know how far out those books are produced or planned, and I don't know how long the list of creators that these editors would like to work with is.
Right.
And you never know those things.
And you don't know whoever's else is in their inbox. You don't know so many
Yeah,
things. Like, there's a level where like, it's very
there's a
hard to
level where it's
kind
just luck. Yeah,
I wouldn't say that, but like, it does come into play for sure. But like, it's very hard to kind of get out of the mass of, unwashed writers, let's say.
yeah.
But then once you do, you're in like this new strata, which is very competitive. Um, and then when you kind of, if you can move up above that strata, it starts to get a little less competitive and then gets really competitive again,
Mm.
because you have these stratas, right? And I think it's just, there's nothing to be gleaned from it. Like, there's no lesson. But it's just it's a weird sort of, reality that in these sorts of industries, the things you think are going to be hard are often easy, and the things you think are going to be easy are often hard.
Yeah, or the things that you think are going to be hard are harder than you imagined, and the things that are harder than those are even harder than that.
Right. And then all of a sudden you'll hit something that's easy again.
Yeah,
It
then you
becomes
break
very.
through. Yeah, you break it out of the clouds, and you're okay again.
I have a friend who I always joke, um, it turned out he at one point was very dissatisfied in his life and decided to take a film class. And it turned out he was a genius. It just turned out that
Don't you hate it
was
when that happens?
it just turned out that was the thing he was a genius at. He might not ever have done it if he
Yeah.
hadn't, been and he did it late in life.
Yeah.
But and it hasn't necessarily been smooth sailing for him. But he hit certain things, at certain moments, and
Yeah.
and then starts to hit walls again, right? Like there's all sorts of. It's very hard to predict and make a plan for your career. You can, but you have to really be willing to, uh, as you say, adjust as you're sort of moving toward the mountain, as it were, or
Mhm.
take advantage of things that come your way. And like, you have to kind of walk a weird line of like putting stock in what you've done and taking and being proud of what you've done and showing it off, but also not getting too big a head about it. It's an odd line
Yeah.
to walk. I would say that you're almost in a weird position right now where, how do you feel about the moment of your career right now, as I guess my sort of final question? Because from my point of view, you're in a weird stage, where it's very questionable what maybe to do next.
Yeah. I mean, next, I'm working on the Laundryman book too. I'm more excited about that right now, honestly, than I am about Zatannic Panic because I've seen the effect that Laundryman Volume 1 has had on my life and my finances and my career. Um, it's tangible, and to see the number of people that buy that book is always incredible. And I have no idea what Zatannic Panic is going to do. I have no idea what it's going to look like. I have no idea whether or not I have done my job in the sense of being pleasant to work with and being the type of creative that can get another job at DC. I hope you always hope for it, but there's nothing that's guaranteed. And we're one market correction away from there being no work for anyone. So it's impossible to know. So how do I feel about my career right now? Again, I'm trying to enjoy the success, and I'm also really excited about all of the other things that I'm working on that I can control. And as each project comes along, I'm gonna assess how it gets me closer to or further from the mountain, and maybe now that mountain's gonna change. It's hard to know. Um, I'm just really enjoying I'm really just enjoying making things and having the time to make things because, as we've seen with certain creatives in our lives, circumstances in life change sometimes, and then you find out that making things ends up on the back burner for a bit. So I'm enjoying it while I can.
Well, everyone again needs to pre-order Satanic Panic, and also should pick up the Laundryman if you haven't already. Um, yeah, infinitestudio.ca, I believe, is your website, Lynn, where,
InfiniteStudio.ca, and if you're interested in the Laundryman Volume 2, Book 2, you can go sign up for the Kickstarter pre-launch page today at laundryman.ca.
Great idea. Great idea. Well, thanks again for talking to me, Lyndon, and keep
Thanks so much.
righting the wrong way.
We got the